different. But what happened then is something which really determined the developments over the quarter century. Remember, two important events happened there. One is the increase in real interest rates, and the second is increase in fuel prices. Now, countries that were heavily indebted and they were importers of fuel did not recover from that crisis for 25 years. And that was the reason why Latin America grew at 0%, that was the last decade, why East European countries grew at 0 and actually communism fell, and why Africa went backwards. Now, my fear is that actually this crisis, with some constellation of factors, again, high interest rates or possibly increased price of food, might lead to the similar bifurcation of countries. Some countries that for 25 years may not be able to recover, and others maybe who would actually survive, do well, and after like 2 or 3 years of crisis go up. But I cannot tell, apart now which country is which, because I think that would really depend on how the crisis evolves.
Okay. Interesting. Reading some of your papers, one comes down to a very basic question. And I believe economists and yourself have certain views about it. And that is, does this inequality actually matter?
Global inequality.
Yes, global inequality.
Yes, well, of course, there are some people who say no. And the key reason they say no is they say, well, there is no global government, so who cares? In other words, if there is a government, the government is elected by people, and if there is high inequality in a country, maybe there will be riots, maybe there will be no investments because the property rights would not be secure, maybe the poor people would be outvoting the rich people. So there are some reasons why you should care or worry. But global, they say globally it really doesn't matter. Well, there are of course counter arguments to that. The counter arguments are basically, I would say, two. One first counter argument is that what happens with globalization and increasing global inequality is that absolute increase of income for the very poor may not be any longer sufficient to make them happy if they see this widening gap between themselves and the rest of the world. In other words, aspirations go up. This is something which we see retrieved from surveys of individuals. People always compare themselves to what is their aspiration level. Well, aspiration level, if you're isolated, is going to be your country or your village. And that we know also historically. There was no inequality if you look at only at your village, because everybody was equally poor. It's only when you see somebody from the city who is richer that you start thinking about that. So that might actually lead to lots of unhappiness and possible turmoil. And what is important there to realize that the process of globalization by itself, by making people realize that, makes it unavoidable. So it's not, you cannot delink the two. You cannot say, well, there is globalization and we will trade in goods and we will send capital and of course we will not accept people, but we will do all these other things and then you should not think yourself poor. Well, you have to think yourself poor because you're going to see people who are rich. And the second element then, which goes with that, is the issue of migration. And of course, I alluded to that. I think actually the fact that these large inter-country differences exist, people in rich countries have a huge, what I call citizenship premium. So everything else being the same, you get a huge premium of like twice the income of somebody else simply because of citizenship. Well, then of course what is going to happen is what we're seeing today is actually people would like to become somebody else, which means they would migrate to the rich countries. And that provokes, of course, problems socially for jobs and others that we see. I don't want to go into that topic much, but we can just see it in Europe. We can see it between Indonesia and Malaysia, for example, in Asia. We can see it obviously between Mexico and the building of the Mexican Wall. And we can see it partly with Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So these pressures, and of course Africa and Europe. So these pressures are very real, and I think potentially they are, I don't see exactly how they will be dealt with.
If we project a little bit into the future, and let this be the last question, beyond the present crisis and so forth, do you envisage that globalization would take place and may lead to a global polity? In fact, is that a possibility, or is that a dream or something we should not aspire for? I'll leave the question open.
Yes, it's a very good question. I actually even wrote something about that. You know, I think that ultimately, but this is, we go, of course, in a very sort of a speculative direction. I think ultimately this, it's not even government, but I would say some global governance will appear, and actually it does appear. I mean, if you go, you have to take a little bit longer perspective on that. And obviously the fact that there is United Nations, that there are many UN agencies, so that there is like much more coordination. Even now it would be about the financial, before it was the Basel rules, that there is there is lots of WTO regulations. There is clearly much more of governance now than existed 30 or 100 years ago. So I think this trend will continue, but of course we might have problems with how that governance is decided, because it's generally decided by the rich countries, and the participation of the poorer countries, however large they are, has been really marginal until now. Now this might change, as we can see, with the greater importance of G20, which now seemed suddenly to acquire greater importance than G8, which I think it's a welcome development. So in that sense, I see that these small movements in that direction, but I think that we are not going to see something which is going to be called global government, but we might see some much more of this global governance. And I know that I would definitely sort of look forward to. I would definitely support.
Thank you very much. Branko, that was indeed most informative, and it's greatly appreciated. I think it's given us a lot of food for thought. I'd now like to open up the floor for questions from the audience. May I request you please to have the mic with you before, and to identify yourselves before you ask the question. Thank you.
My question is, have you done any study as to the role of corruption in global inequality, and what role that plays? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is, again, it's not simply a compliment, but it's really a very good question. I was thinking of that recently, and I even had somebody who is actually done Baker, who has done very important work on figuring out, together now with the IMF, the illegal flows, particularly the illegal flows from the third world countries. But unfortunately, I have to say no, and I will give you the reason. The reason is that all the work that I do, as I explained at the beginning, is really based on household surveys and information that you get about consumption or income of people. And you cannot tell, when people tell you, my consumption is so and so, so much, you cannot tell where that money comes from and whether it is illegal or not. But I really think that it is somehow, I really don't see how exactly, but I think it would be very good to sort of marry these two things, you know, global inequality and the global corruption, as it were, because it certainly contributes to global